last few months, I need to show myself a little before I hand over to the chair. So thank you for your cooperation, everybody, for coming and for all the support in all the ways you have supported. Thank you very much. I now hand over to the chair.
Wow. Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Paul. I would like to welcome everyone to this yet another important episode of the Higher Education and Human Development Hybrid webinar series. Good afternoon in the room and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our online participants. Today, we are excited to be joined by two wonderful scholars whom I have a pleasure to an honor to introduce. We are going to be discussing, the title of the discussion is Between Crisis and Refusal, Academic Freedom and Public Argument. And to help us unpack this important discussion, we have the main presenter, Professor Nimi Hoffmann. Professor Hoffmann is an assistant professor at the Center for International Education at the University of Sussex. Our research focuses on African intellectual communities and social policy. Then our main discussant for today is Professor McKenna, who is a professor of higher education research at Rhodes University, South Africa. Our research interests include what knowledge is legitimated in academy and what is not, and who gets to access this knowledge and who does not. She currently undertakes research on the university rankings industry, academic publishing industry, and the implications of artificial intelligence for higher education role as a public good. She manages several international projects, mainly focused on doctoral education. So, Professor, you will have 30 minutes to do your presentation, and after which we'll yield the floor to the discussant, who will be given about 15 minutes to share our reflections. I'll be able to remind you when it's 10 minutes to go. I'll raise a placard, and during your conclusion, I'll also raise another placard to signal the depletion of your time. To our online participants, kindly be reminded to mute your mics. You'll be allowed to unmute, especially during Q&A, when you'll be recognized to submit to make your submission. For now, let me invite Professor Nimi to share our slides and begin our presentation. Over to you, Professor.
Okay, thanks so much, you guys. And my name is just Nimi. Don't worry about titles and stuff, okay, please. Thank you so much for having me here. It's such an honor. It really, really is. I'm just going to read. I don't have any slides. No death by PowerPoint today. I'm just going to read. And if at any point I am speaking too softly or too quickly, please don't hesitate to interrupt me and just say, hey, can you slow down, or we can't hear you. Okay. All right. So, so this piece really reflects on academic freedom as public argument. And I find myself turning to the question of academic freedom over and over. This is in part because of the shrinking academic freedom that I have experienced while working in England, which is increasingly circumscribed by state repression, authoritarianism, and proto-fascist social movements. It is also in part because universities in the UK are collapsing. About 30,000 people have lost their jobs in the last 18 months, and 50 universities are at risk of shutting down in the next year. Such is the hostility to universities in the UK that this news is often met with public celebration. But As a South African, I find myself also turning to the question of academic freedom because the peoples of the South have entered a perma-crisis as unprecedented debt, global hunger, conflict, and climate apartheid bear down upon them. These different contexts have again made academic freedom a sharp question, a biting question, a dangerous question. I think there is something about crisis and the refusal to give into it, the refusal to flee intellectually and politically by retreating from self-critique. In the dance between these two, between crisis and refusal, a possibility opens of thinking deeper and more carefully. I want us to turn to Kampala, Uganda, in 1990, amid an economic and political crisis so bruising that African societies have yet to emerge from it. The great Malawian economist Thandika Mkandawire called this the Great African Depression. They faced a situation much like today. As oil prices rose, inflation spiraled, and their currencies collapsed, many African countries were faced with a balance of payment crisis. They had insufficient US dollars to import critical supplies of medicine, petrol, and fertilizer. In return for dollar-denominated loans from the IMF and the World Bank, they agreed to change the structure of their societies, including substantial divestment from education and healthcare, which had hitherto been generally universal and free. So not many people know, across Africa and across the global South, one of the first things that happened at independence, every government, regardless of their political orientation, declared that education and healthcare would be universal and free. Most people have lost memory of this emancipatory history. And it's because of this period now when the entire project of post-independence governments was dismantled. So this massive divestment in education was followed by the exclusion of students, particularly impoverished and female students, book famines, the collapse in research and postgraduate training, mass protests and violent government crackdowns. About 100,000 academics and specialists left the continent, and they were replaced with about 100,000 experts from former colonial powers and the United States at a cost of $4 billion, which was then added to the debt African countries had to repay. It was in this context that Cadastria, or the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, convened a Pan-African group of academics, students, trade unionists, social movement activists, and journalists in Kampala to ask, what does it mean to be free as an intellectual? Their responses to this question are diverse and surprising. They debate the role of language in intellectual work. They examine the dynamics of capitalism and patriarchy in the academy. They critique the relationship between intellectuals, the state, and civil society. And they consider how to historicize the changing social function of African universities. But fundamentally, their debates come to center on one idea: that intellectual freedom is not the freedom from restraint, a negative freedom. On the contrary, it is the freedom to serve, a positive freedom. The resulting Kampala Declaration on Intellectual Freedom and Social Responsibility locates intellectual freedom as part of broader social struggles for freedom. The preamble begins, African people are responding to these intolerable conditions by intensifying their struggles for democracy and human rights. The struggle for intellectual freedom is an integral part of the struggle of our people for human rights. It goes on to stipulate that the intellectual community has the responsibility to struggle for and participate in the struggle of the popular forces for their rights and emancipation. The Kampala Declaration consequently departs in a number of ways from international discourses on academic freedom, such as in the Lima Declaration and the Academic Freedom Index. Not only does it provide a positive account of intellectual freedom, but it also refuses to abstract rights from the contestations that produce those rights. In other words, it grounds the realization of the rights to intellectual freedom in the concrete political and economic struggles of intellectuals and society more generally. Thus, unlike the Lima Declaration and the Academic Freedom Index, it emphasizes the requirement for independent government funding to sustain the material conditions for academic freedom and stresses the need for deep democracy within the university. In other words, without public funding of the university, you cannot have academic freedom. One can see then the emergence of a distinctive and new conceptualization of academic freedom as a component of a broader class of intellectual freedoms grounded in the social responsibilities of intellectuals. This is significant, for the Kampala Declaration represents the fruits of the first sustained reflections on the academic project by a Pan-African community, and it therefore continues to function as a key reference point for conceptualizing academic freedom and investigating its breaches on the continent today. But the relationship between intellectual freedom and social responsibility is not uncomplicated or uncontested, and its conceptualization in the Kampala Declaration was an outcome of heated debates at the conference, many of which were published in a more polished form in the book Academic Freedom in Africa. Today, I can only gesture at the outlines of the debate, but I hope it whets your appetite for more. I want to convince you of the value of engaging with these ideas. First, they identify two meanings of the freedom to serve. One meaning hinges on an appreciation of how academics and intellectuals more broadly require the support of society to defend their freedoms successfully. And this appreciation is located within an understanding of the historical role of African universities in the post-independence period. As Mahmoud Mamdani put it, driven into a corner, we discovered local communities. To them, we must appear like potted plants in greenhouses, of questionable aesthetic value, or mere anthropological oddities with curious habits and strange dresses, practitioners of some modern witchcraft. Intellectuals therefore had a responsibility to undo the social and epistemic alienation. He says, if we are to think of the possibility of African universities drawing resources from communities of working people, then it will be necessary that the universities nourish these communities in 1,001 ways. These are the kinds of debates that contributed to calls to decolonize the university. A second way of approaching intellectual freedom as the freedom to serve is to emphasize that in pursuing their social responsibilities, intellectuals' freedoms are expanded. This is so because accountability to those who are more vulnerable in society helps to unhinge intellectuals from their function as legitimizers of power, and therefore encourages more creative, democratic, and rigorous forms of knowledge production. On this reading, proximity to power narrows the ability to think freely. One example of this is Mamadou Djerf's account of the social function of Europhone intellectuals in Senegal and Sufi Wolof intellectuals who predated the colonial state. So these are Sufi scholars who were also warriors, as a bit of context. And they, in the 1800s, the Sufi brotherhoods, these scholar warriors were at the forefront of resisting the slave trade and colonization. And this was how Senegal became quite a Muslim country. So people converted to Islam during this time. And in that way, these Sufi intellectuals became very, very important to the society. He says, instead of seeing these two groups as fundamentally different, Diouf places them on two poles of the Senegalese intellectual movement that have acted as two parts of a single continuum. So Sufi Wolof intellectuals that predate the colonial states on one hand, and then French-speaking intellectuals in Senegal who are part of the kind of colonial and post-colonial project. So he says they're not two separate things. They're part of the same continuum. Sufi Wolof intellectuals had initially gained their power from opposing the transatlantic slave trade. But the learned families belonging to the Sufi brotherhoods went on to maintain this power through their accommodation with political authority, much like Europhone intellectuals, Francophone intellectuals. In the post-independence period then, intellectuals from both traditions continued to adopt this vanguardist position, seeing themselves working in partnership with the states as the prime mover of history. In the sense, oh, we are intellectuals, we are at the head of society, we are the thinkers of the society. We move the society forward. And this meant, because they saw themselves in this vanguardist position, this meant they could be easily co-opted. And as the junior partners of political elites, intellectuals across the spectrum were put to work in the service of sustaining political hegemony. Their work became thin and ossified, and they struggled to speak truths that were plain for all to see. Thus, for Diouf, it is precisely in this role as agents of hegemony that intellectual freedoms came to be circumscribed, since intellectual work must constantly be shaped and reshaped to the purposes of power. Diouf contrasts these constraints on freedom with the role that female intellectuals played in Senegal. He argues that at the time, they were neither caught within an inflexible religious aristocracy, nor were they alienated from the popular classes, since they established relationships and dialogues with groups composed of dispossessed women. On this account, their distance from power meant that female intellectuals had a greater capacity to produce scholarship that was both avant-garde and popular, rigorous and creative. It is precisely their lack of material power that gave rise to a kind of radical intellectual freedom. But if intellectual freedom is the freedom to serve, then what is it to serve? Out of the arguments emerges a subtle and complex position. Drawing from his experience of the terrible attack on intellectuals by Algerian civil society in the 1990s, where basically civil society murdered thousands of intellectuals. So this is basically religious social movements, killing intellectuals and attacking them for being intellectuals. Drawing on this experience, Amin Khan conceptualizes intellectual service as a political and epistemic dilemma. Intellectuals have, on the one hand, to avoid the traps of imperial value systems masquerading as universal truths. On the other hand, they must steer clear of anthropological sentimentalism, stupidly glorifying society sliding into ruin. Instead of being impaled on the two horns of this dilemma, he offers a third way: to refuse to seek affirmation and acknowledgement from either the state, civil society, or foreign donors, and instead to prioritize the search for deep understandings, deep truths. Put differently, the broader social relevance of intellectuals is precisely their irrelevance, and therefore their ability to engage in the heresies that societies may not want to hear, but need to hear. But these are not monologues delivered from on high. Instead, there are conversations with society in which thinkers outside the university enter into the university, such as griots in West Africa entering into the university, or thinkers inside the university leave the university to enter into intellectual work outside of it, such as the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. On this view, intellectual freedom and responsibility are constitutive of argument, rather than intellectual freedom being grounded in social responsibility. It is the broader project of enabling society to resume its dialogue with itself, that gives meaning to and justifies both freedom and responsibility. They go on to develop this notion of conversation and argument much more deeply. But at its heart is an understanding that everyone has a right to intellectual labor, everyone, and that the life of the mind, of reasoned and open argument, is the lifeblood of all societies. It is precisely for this reason that the destruction of universities under structural adjustment was so terrible. As Atoseki Otto argues, attacking the basis upon which a society enters into conversation with itself is precisely what colonial rule was. Colonialism, and I quote, as an episode in the life of a people, a rude interruption of the rhythms and idioms that sustain their local and common humanity, a digression from the terms of their moral argument with themselves. It follows from this that decolonization, the post-apartheid, is first and foremost a resumption of interrupted history, a resumption not indeed of some original purities and essences before the fall, but of interrupted dramas, indigenous and universal dramas. Above all, a resumption of our dialogue with one another, with ourselves. What does this intellectual history mean for us today? We who live in a period that is in the process of breaking quite definitively with the past. We who must confront a world order in which ideals are sneered at and power and violence are valorized for their own sake. The emancipatory worldviews underlying these Pan-African deliberations were like the bedrock upon which the ideas of intellectual freedom could flow. But these emancipatory worldviews seem to be cracking under the terrible weight of a colonial genocide and climate collapse, and with it perhaps the normative weight of their understandings of freedom. In more concrete terms, for example, these Pan-African arguments about intellectual freedom often presume an African state which gives coherence and meaning to the critique. Yet, as African states seem to slowly disintegrate, and as the very notion of the public good disintegrates before our eyes, so too do these arguments for intellectual freedom. Put differently, if intellectual freedom is a historical concept, then there is no sense in hoping to find an a priori definition, one which transcends space and time. Each generation of thinkers has the responsibility to work out what freedom means for them in their particular historical context. And there is no pre-existing recipe or definition of freedom that allows us to opt out from this responsibility. But I believe this Pan-African work on intellectual freedom is nevertheless of value for us, for what it teaches us of how to think about freedom. I conclude with 5 brief thoughts. First, if intellectual freedom is to be found, perhaps it begins in the refusal to retreat from self-critique. Freedom thinking requires courage. Second, perhaps our proximity to power is an unfreedom. It constrains our ability to think freely, to think wildly, to think heresy. The further we are away from power, the freer we become. Freedom thinking is allergic to power. Third, perhaps the meanings of intellectual freedom are not purely solitary. They are to be found in collective deliberation and public argument. Freedom thinking is communal. Fourth, perhaps the ability of a society to argue with itself is the basis of its sovereignty. take away this internal dialogue and argument, and what is left is a hollow, broken thing. Freedom thinking is a necessary condition of sovereignty. And fifth, perhaps we are not free as thinkers if other people do not have their freedoms too. Your unfreedom is my unfreedom. Freedom thinking is a form of entanglement. These are fragments of thoughts, but I hope they are thoughts with which to weave our freedom thinking. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Nimi, for those valuable arguments and thought-provoking ideas. Let me now invite Professor McKenna to share our reflective insights on this discourse. Professor, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to start with the same comment that Nimi did. My name is Sue. If you call me Professor, then everything I say has to be very sensible and meaningful. So I think if we just stick to Sue, then the bar is not going to be too high, and I can probably live up to it. Nimi, as I said to you before we started, I absolutely loved your paper. It sent me down all sorts of reading and thinking. And despite the very depressing introductory comments that you just made about higher education in the UK and in South Africa, I think the focus on your paper on refusal as a counter to the realities of the crisis is so vitally optimistic and so necessary. So we have to understand the problem if we are to refuse it. But it's important to note that, your paper sat with the refusal rather than just feeling overwhelmed by the crisis aspects. There was so much that I take away from your paper and from your presentation today. Intellectual freedom as the freedom to serve. I think that is absolutely crucial in an era where it really is all about the status and power of the individual. It's good for us to remember that real freedom is the freedom to serve. Intellectual freedom requires bravery, that sometimes you might feel like you're a lone voice, but that's what it sometimes requires. And then importantly, that it is collective, that it is a communal activity. It is entangled. My freedom and your freedom really rest on each other. So those were some really big overarching ideas that I took away from your paper. But I think intellectually, probably the biggest contribution that the paper makes is to move that 1994 volume, the Kampala volume, away from being a book that you can read as kind of documenting of the conditions for academic freedom, and instead read it, as you have done, as a kind of implicit theory of the university as the space whereby society has a conversation, a dialogue with itself, as a key social structure in navigating, in nurturing that societal dialogue. I think, Nimi, that you're completely right, that conceptual possibility rests sort of throughout the whole text, perhaps more explicit in one or two chapters than in others. But it isn't really named in the text itself. And I think that your paper really names this, and that's useful and important work. I thought that your synthesis of the palaver or public sphere issue was really important, as I said. And it's not something that I think we have sufficient conversations about at the moment. And it really, to me, the whole idea of the university as this contributor to or space of palaver, space of public sphere, space of society's conversation with itself, that really, to me, just stands in complete contradiction to universities where it's compliance that's rewarded, it's productivity that's valorized. And of course, that productivity is often just vacuous, measurable outputs. And I think that rejecting that, as you very clearly articulate, and I actually captured this particular phrase, it requires us to unhinge ourselves as intellectuals from the university's function as legitimizers of power. And that is hard because that is kind of baked into the system, certainly the modern system. And I think that the extent to which universities see their role as speaking truth to power, especially in regards to the power of the state, is quite limited in an era where we have embraced the idea that we are legitimizers of power. And on this, you drew in the paper, I don't think you quoted it now in the presentation, but you drew a lot on Mamdani's chapter, but in particular in your paper, you drew on Mamdani's remark that the relationship between higher education as the space of public conversation with its society's conversation with itself, the relationship between that understanding of higher education and nationalism is contradictory. And it remains so today. And I want to quote the quote from Mamdani's chapter that you actually have in the full paper. On the one hand, higher education was the fruit of nationalism. But on the other hand, nationalist power stifles critical thought. And in the light of the Afrophobia that we see rising in South Africa right now, this raises absolutely key questions about the role of the university in participating in the public sphere, in society's conversation about itself. Only Nelson Mandela University has come out and publicly said a damn thing about the rise in xenophobia, Afrophobia that we are experiencing in South Africa. The only university. And the rest of us are silent. And the few of us who've spoken out as individuals have very quickly been publicly chastised. And this is just such a clear opportunity for us to participate far more explicitly in society's conversation about itself. Having said how much I absolutely loved the paper, there were a couple of points, it's not criticism so much as issues that I thought I'd like to sort of scratch your brain a little bit further on. The first is that, as I said, what for me was so powerful is the way that you really very evocatively raised this conversation about the university as a public space, and I think that's a really core contribution because it's throughout the book, but it's not explicitly throughout the book, and you've really helped us to see that golden thread. But I wonder if doing that, maybe you've slightly collapsed the tensions in which the different chapters actually conceptualize this, because I think Khan's third way kind of rejects any authority, refuses to recognize any authority, including society itself. And I wonder if that's not in some tension with the Palava model, which is more, I think, about the universities recognizing its being in and of society. And the Palava model, I think, presupposes a community and dialogue. I think Khan, to some extent, sort of suggests that that dialogue can simply be wrong, and sometimes our job is to reject it in its entirety. And I do think in the paper you definitely acknowledge that tension, but I think you pass over it quite quickly, and I'd love to hear more about those tensions. You start off the paper talking about structural adjustment project and how that had really disastrous and ongoing effects on Africa's higher education sector, and it certainly gave us the backdrop. It gave your readers the backdrop that forces us to ask questions about social relevance. But in the end, I felt like your argument is more timeless. It's more about the nature of intellectual freedom generally, which is very evocative and quite stirring. But I wonder if it isn't worth returning to it and asking, what is it about the specific context of post sort of and variations of structural adjustment project and the specific nature of today's crisis that makes this conceptualization particularly urgent? Of course, maybe we should be able to read between the lines and figure that out. And on a similar note, you're obviously reading the 1994 book from this position of saying, you know, right now, higher education is once again in crisis. The world is in crisis. So what does it mean to apply that Kampala framework, the Kampala Declaration, and everything that's said in that Kampala 1994 book to the current university, highly marketized, audit culture, managerialism? I completely share and loved that the idea that the book, and this is quoting Nimi here, I love this phrase, the book is an act of astonishing and fierce hope. So I kind of thought, yes, it is, and it was then. What does that mean now? How do we create the palaver, the public sphere in today's university? I believe that our work, maybe I'm being naive here, but I believe I work in one of the least managerial universities in South Africa. But in what I reckon it to be the least managerial university in South Africa, I am battling with increasing managerialism. I'm battling to convince colleagues on the need to revitalize Senate in the light of universities being captured all around us by both internal and external forces. I am battling to get that voice heard. So, yeah, what does it mean for here and now? My fourth critique or comment, my last one, is about the book itself and Kadesria. So Nimi and I saw each other last at Kadesria's last conference. It was an amazing intellectual space. It was a buzz. It was great. I'm not trying to blame Kadesria here for Kadesria is just one symptom, I think, of a much bigger problem. I don't want to blame an organization, but why is it so hard to get these spaces, these social spaces within our university, but outside of our universities as well? Do you know how hard it was to access the book? You cannot get it open access. It's not available online. Luckily, Rhodes University has a hard copy of it, but you know, why is it so hard to circulate these conversations and these ideas? What would it take to more positively contribute to the palaver? So, to conclude, thank you, Nimi. Excellent paper. I really hope it gets a very wide engagement. I think it reasserts the possibilities that universities can and should do much more than credential and can actually provide a significant, nurturing, nourishing role in society's conversations with and about itself. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much, So, for those brilliant comments. I must say, both of you have been very magnanimous with time. You've presented within the stipulated time. So for now, let me invite Nimi to just react to the comments that have been posed by So. Nimi.
Okay. I'm also hoping that colleagues who are online and in the physical space as well will get a chance, because I'd love to hear your thoughts alongside Sue's. Sue, wow, I feel like we need to have this conversation as well after this. It's like a very long conversation. I think, you know, in terms of Afrophobia in South Africa, one of the reasons that I wanted to give this paper now specifically is because it helps us to think about the value of Pan-African thought, like Pan-Africanism as a mode of inquiry. And right now there's a very strong kind of politics of despair in South Africa. I think people are despairing with the fact that apartheid hasn't ended. They are despairing with the fact that inequality has gotten much more intense over the last 30 years, and much more entrenched. And that there is no vocabulary for talking about what is essentially a form of racial capitalism. There's just no vocabulary, there's no public spaces. You know, the trade union movement is moribund. The EFF is has been punished by voters. There are very, you know, and then the practices of, like, for example, study groups in unions, trade unions. The study group was an extremely important mechanism for collective reflection and learning that has, like, largely collapsed within South African society. And so we don't have spaces anymore for us to come together and think about our condition and theorize it, whether within the university or outside of the university, whether we're farm workers or mine workers or cleaners or doctors or academics or whatever it is. We don't have those spaces, and people are despairing, right? And so that's the response. The response to despair is to find people who are weaker than you, right? But I think so. That was kind of one of the reasons why I really wanted to kind of engage with this Pan-African thought as a mode of thinking, not just an ideal, but a way of thinking. Because what comes out of this piece is that it's not the individual thinkers that are important so much as what happens between them. So between them, so each individual thinker has their own discrete position, none of which is actually the same as what I outline in that text. What I outline is something that emerges as part of the collective deliberation, and that collective deliberation is Pan-Africanist. So we cannot actually have even this way of thinking freedom without Pan-Africanism is the condition for thinking freedom in this text. And so it's that we have to find that space for politics of hope. We cannot just critique people for being Afrophobic and say this is wrong. You know, what about the 1 million Mozambicans and the 1 million Angolans who died, you know, because of the apartheid regime? Like, we can't be doing those things. We've got to find a way of changing the way we think about our society and the way we come together. So that was the one thought. Very briefly, just in terms of Cadestro, you know, Cadestro was actually, all of its work from the beginning used to be open access before there was any internet. So they used to actually they publish their books and then distribute them for free across Africa. So they were like the first knowledge commons before there was even the language to describe the knowledge commons. And in fact, almost all of their books were like, they digitized, were all freely available. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, they began putting up a paywall. And the reason for this is because of the asymmetry, I think, whereby it's not being open access in the global south is not the same thing as being open access in the global north. I think was their argument, that they felt like they were creating all of this work that was just being exploited. And I don't know, like, I need to go back and like kind of really interrogate this, but they've lost that identity that they had for more than 40 years, which is really sad. And then in terms of the palaver in today's university and the meaning of Senate and that kind of thing, I'm just going to briefly mention a couple of things about British universities. So I think people in South Africa tend to have an idea of like the UK as an ideal utopian country. In my experience, which I always find extremely frustrating because it's actually quite a fascist system. I am afraid to say many things lest I go to jail. I have friends of mine who are facing 14 years jail as terrorists for a single tweet. So they're in jail for 14 years as terrorists for one tweet. Okay. And universities are like that too. So I have to be very careful about anything that I say in public to my students or to my colleagues, because there is a system of surveillance. By law, I'm required to surveil all my students, and my colleagues are required to surveil me. And if I say anything that sounds like radicalization, if I'm anti-capitalist, anti-racist, if I have concerns around climate change, if I'm an Irish Republican, if I'm a communist, if I exhibit solidarity with Palestine, all of these things are signs of radicalization, and I can be referred to the anti-terror police. I'm already on the anti-terror police watch list, which means that all of my actions are surveilled. Every time I move somewhere, leave the country, re-enter, everything is surveilled for the rest of my life. Okay. So like, It's really extreme. And within the university, there's no meaningful democracy at all. Like none. It is extremely hierarchical and authoritarian. And as a result, you have these like CEOs, basically vice chancellors who are these unelected CEOs who wreak havoc on universities. They get into all sorts of corrupt dealings with the private sector, spend tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of pounds on very dodgy deals, and then bankrupt the universities. And that's one of the reasons why our UK universities are collapsing. So I've spent like years and years trying to talk about democracy within the British university. And every time I use the word democracy, people look at me like I'm saying a dirty word. It's like a trigger word, like the word social justice or solidarity. It's like not a polite word to use in public. Um, but I keep doing it, Sue, and like slowly but surely we are finding ways to fight back. But it is, whatever you think is happening in the South African Academy, and I know, for example, at Fort Hare, how intense it has been, but like the scale of the state repression is so extreme in the UK. It is so that should give you, and we are nonetheless fighting back. So that should give a sense of hope, but also a space for us to kind of compare notes and strategies. And, because for example, I try to convince my colleagues, I say, but there are parts of the world which have democratically elected senates or senators that are composed of the professoriate where everybody gets to vote and they actually have power within the university and the vice chancellor is elected and the dean is elected and they just look at me like I'm crazy. And then I give examples like, Makerere University in Uganda, and then they look at me like I've insulted them. Right? They're like, how dare you? But we can laugh, but it's the same in South Africa. If South African universities were to compare themselves to other African universities, 9 times out of 10, South African colleagues would be insulted. Such is our investment in the European project. So, there are some there are some distressing similarities between the UK and South Africa. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for that brilliant addition to the conversation. For now, we are going to open the floor to Q&A. So in the room and those online, you are now free to ask a question so that a response can be given. Who goes first? Can we begin from the room or online? Okay, there's some comments there from Telly. Thanks a lot, Nimi, for this thought-provoking debate. Some decolonial scholars such as Mbembe, Lovo, argue that intellectual freedom in Africa requires much deeper restructuring of knowledge systems, particularly indigenous knowledge systems, than has occurred since independence. What would a genuinely decolonized South African university look like while still participating in global scholarship? So that's a comment from Tele. Yeah, I think we have some more. Yeah, I think we have a question online. I'm on. You can go ahead and present your submission.
Yes, thank you very much for the thought-provoking debate and paper. I really am intrigued. I'm not an expert in the subject, but I just want to draw on one line from the presentation, which was that proximity to power narrows the space for intellectual freedom. Maybe I paraphrase, maybe it was something along that line. Proximity to power narrows the space for intellectual freedom. And I just have been reflecting since that line was mentioned, is whether there is still a possibility for the poet king, where we have a person from the intellectual community, joining a political space, and then remains intellectually active and with that kind of freedom? Or is it a polarization such that joining one camp makes you quite a nemesis to the other camp? Professor becoming a minister, or a professor becoming a military commander or something like that. Is there still space for a poet king? Yeah, that's my point. That's my question.
Thanks for that question. Who gets to respond to that? The presenter. Okay, fine.
Okay. These are two like extraordinary questions. Thank you so much. I feel like they require a lot of time and many different voices beyond mine. That would be the first thing. Maybe I can bring in some voices. So on the decolonization issue, I think what's really interesting to consider is how there are different traditions of conceptualizing the epistemic impact of colonial rule. So within West Africa, I would think that, there's the kind of like the Ibadan school of history, right? Where there's this kind of conceptualization of colonialism as an episode in a much longer African history. So that was kind of, Atoseki Otto, he's a Ghanaian thinker, but he really is part of that kind of way of thinking, say, oh, colonialism isn't the hinge upon which history turns. It's not like there was the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the post-colonial. Actually, there were many, many different periods, and colonization is just one period in a tens of thousands of years history. And it's a very disturbing period. It's a very negative and destructive one, but it's one period. And then you have, say, in Southern Africa, where there's this really big emphasis on colonialism as basically a Nakba, as a catastrophe, as an epistemic catastrophe, so completely destructive of the knowledge systems of people as part of like a kind of a genocidal intent. And I think these reflect different experiences of the colonial encounter. Because in Southern Africa, you have settler colonialism, which was genocidal, like Khoi and San peoples, like wiped off the face of the earth, for example. 100-year war by predominantly Xhosa-speaking people against the British, like, with slash and burn and famine and slavery, the enslavement of peoples across the Indian Oceans and brought to South Africa. These are horrifying events that are, they just completely reconfigured and destroyed societies. Whereas in West Africa, they couldn't land and live in West Africa because of yellow fever and malaria. So it was called the white man's graveyard, right? And so they were unable to kind of settle. And therefore, the form of colonial extraction was through trade surpluses, okay? So that meant very little investment in infrastructure, right? Very little investment in roads, hospitals, schools. I mean, there was one university for the whole of Anglophone West Africa at independence. One. Compare that with South Africa, which had 11. So it's a very different scenario. And the reason I mention this is because maybe there is something worthwhile to be had in bringing these two intellectual traditions into conversation with each other. It's been done a little bit, but I don't think it's been done systematically and deeply enough. And I think bringing these intellectual traditions into conversation might begin to help us sketch out more concrete ways of thinking about decolonization beyond these very abstract ideas. For example, Mamadou Diouf, who's the Senegalese scholar that I mentioned, he talks about how pre-colonial intellectuals, Sufi Wolof intellectuals who are, who exist before colonization and continue to exist in the post-colonial moment, get co-opted into the state, get co-opted into being legitimizers of power. And in doing so, actually, their kind of dynamism is lost. Their creativity is lost. They become this kind of ossified aristocracy who say nothing of real value. And that's something, you know, that's a situation in which you have people using an African language, engaging in African modes of thinking and knowledge making that are extremely important in communal spaces outside of universities. And yet, in some ways, behaving in the same way as Europhone colonial era intellectuals within the colonial university. So that is something to really consider. And I suppose to then go to the philosopher poet king idea, you know, you've got like, you know, I guess your Nyerere, your Senghor, your Wamba Dia Wamba. I would just note, and I didn't realize this, but you know, Senegal under Senghor sent armed forces to Angola to fight on behalf of the apartheid state. Yeah, you know, because Senghor was co-opted with the whole idea of France-Afrique, right? So there were a number, it was Senegal and it was Malawi and I think Cote d'Ivoire that actually supported the apartheid state in its murderous war against the Angolans. Of course, many African states went and sent people to fight against the apartheid states in Angola, and many died. The Ethiopians, the Somalis, across, you know, Mozambicans, many. But I just note this because our propensity to find a savior in one person, you know, one person, you know, si Sonkem Semang always says all your faves are problematic. Right? We don't want one person to be thinking for us. That's the whole point of this idea of thinking about intellectual freedom, is that it's a collective thing, and everybody has the responsibility to engage in intellectual labor. It doesn't matter if you're a cleaner, if you're a mine worker, if you are a gardener, if you're a factory worker, everybody has that responsibility. And that's a radically different version, different vision of the world from the philosopher king.
Thank you very much. Dr. Paul, you have a question? So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Nimi, for that thought-provoking presentation, and thank you, Sue, for that presentation as well, the reflection. Both of you quite complimented each other nicely in the presentation and the reflection. I see that synergy and I enjoyed it. As you know, both of you, that academic freedom is perennially topical. It's diverse in context and in scope too. I was wondering, well, how would you position an economic condition of many of the African states as one factor that actually limits academic freedom, that allows compromises even with state actors and state governments? And so how would you position that? I mean, South Africa is the only country in Africa, as I know, that pays academic more, even though there's issue. So I don't know much about it, but many other African countries, academics are poorly paid. How do you think of on this question?
I think it's, I mean, Paul, can I just double check with you? Are you Nigerian?
Sure.
Because I
want
want
to. Nigeria. Proud in Nigeria.
Yeah, okay, great. Because I think the and beautifully so. But because I wanted to give a Nigerian example, right? So for a very long time, I used to think that the material conditions were absolutely necessary for intellectual freedom more broadly, not just academic freedom, but intellectual freedom more broadly. You know, if you can't, you know, you need money, for example, to eat, to do research, to have enough time to teach, to have, you know, buildings and so on. And this is true. This is all true. And you can see how the divestment from Nigerian universities, for example, in the 1980s, and Nigerian education in general, it's just like my two mentors in life were products of Nigerian universities in the 1970s. And oh my God, they were the most incredible thinkers I have ever, you know, had the honor to be mentored by. And both of them came from peasant families, small rural peasant families that had no money, but they went to school and to university for free. And they received a world-class education, like an incredible education. You know, Nigerian intellectuals of a particular period are extraordinary thinkers that will completely restructure the way you think about the world, like the Ibadan School of History. And like that has been lost, I think, in part because of the material assault on African societies, right? Through structural adjustment, through not having control over your own resources, right? Nigeria is a particularly stark example of that. And what happens, the social disintegration and the conflict that emerges from that. But I think even more importantly, actually, than the money issue is the imagination issue. Because as far as I can tell, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but like people have given up on the idea of a state in Nigeria. They've given up on the idea of public goods. They've given up on the idea that that the Nigerian state is an emancipatory project and that you guys are capable of governing yourselves because the only thing you ever talk about is corruption. The only thing. And so stuck in your mind is this idea that to be African is to be corrupt and therefore not to be capable of self-government. Right? This is a very strong, I mean, I'm posing this in a very strong and unnuanced way, but I get this from my students from across Africa every single time. The one thing they can only talk about every day, day in and day out, is corruption. And in fact, actually, this petty corruption is not the driver of our ills on the continent. Like empirically, it is not, right? Emphatically, it is not. But because it is the only thing in our media, it sucks up the oxygen and the ability to think about anything else. And so for me, I see Nigeria as like further on the road from where South Africa is, because we're going in your direction too. We're slowly also losing faith in the notion of a state, in the notion of the emancipatory project of the state, in the idea of public goods and taking care of each other. And we're retreating into this idea of like privatized healthcare, privatized education, privatized neighborhoods, privatized transports, and so on. Each person for themselves, right? And when you have that, then the conditions for intellectual freedom are not there because intellectual freedom is not the freedom for you as an individual to think. It is the freedom for us collectively to enter into argument with each other. So it's that we have to recover that political imagination. That's a political project of conscientization. And I hope I hope like the way I said it, Paul, I hope it comes across respectfully because I only mean it with the greatest. No, honestly, it is so painful to see how much the idea of
Can I interject a little? We are going to continue the conversation, you and I, some other time. But I also think it's a colonial thing. Sometimes the European world paints Africa as so corrupt, whereas the kind of corruption that goes on in the West are given different names. Okay, so that's so we can talk about that. No, that is not excusing Nigeria from being corrupt and many other African countries from being corrupt. But I'm saying that there is a colonial touch to that. Okay, I think Prof wants to say something. Then.
Okay, she's done. All right. I think we've come to the.
Do you know what the problem is?
Huh? Oh, okay. Yeah. Is there anyone online who would want to make a submission?
Or Professor Sue wants to say something?
Yeah.
No, I think I totally agree with the conversation that's been taking place. I think the only thing I want to add around the economy is, of course, I don't want to underestimate how awful poverty is and how important the material goods of a university are. But in the end, probably the biggest constraint the economy gives us is ideological, and maybe that comes back to Nimi's point about imagination, is to understand the economy not just as how much money is available, but to understand it as an ideology. And I think that the way in which we have perhaps latched onto a very narrow conceptualization of what an economic order should look like without understanding the ideological baggage that brings with us. One of which, of course, one aspect of which is this very individualistic, competitive understanding of the world, which means that success is the extent to which you can privatize every aspect of your life. And I think that, yeah, so I think when we worry about economic issues, we should always bring into the conversation the underpinning ideology of what that economic order understands it is to be human, to be on this planet. Because perhaps having those conversations will probably be more effective in changing things than just bemoaning the lack of money or indeed corruption or any other economic aspect. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think, Nimi, you can also maybe advance your concluding. Maybe just in a second or two.
Say again?
Or would you wish to say something just in your conclusion?
I mean, I think I've heard my voice for a very long time. I'm sure you're tired of my voice by now. But just to say thank you, really, really thank you. And I will Paul, I can send you a slightly updated version of that paper along with my email address. And if anybody wants to engage with it, I would love to hear your thoughts. And yeah, thank you for your time and your presence.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. And on behalf of the center and the organizer, and indeed on my own behalf, we appreciated that you are here. And for now, it's bye.
Bye-bye, Sue. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye all. Thank you.
Bye.